Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Infernal Intercourse with me and Pastor Brian. I'd like to thank you all for making the last video that I put up have 82 views within 24 hours, which has never happened before. So within 24 hours, it became my 5th most watched video. So that was kind of cool. It was also our first dislike. So I don't know what the person disliked. They didn't leave a comment, but maybe they were just being snarky. I don't know.
And we love your dislike. That's okay. Although we wish you'd leave a comment so we really knew what you're thinking.
Because it was the episode favorite scene. So it's not even the one where we said maybe some not particularly mainstream religious things. So, but whatever. We love it. Thank you for watching that video a lot. I hope and go back and comment. Tell us what your favorite scenes were. Nobody did, so we'd really like to know what you have liked about Lucifer. But today we're going to talk about queer theology. So I want to throw it over to Brian first of all to give us some kind of definition of queer theology.
Great, thank you. So one of the things that, if you're circulating in the world of queer theory or queer theology, I would always start by saying, hello, I'm Brian, and my pronouns are he and him. And because I live on the border, I would say, or L. But one of the things I'm observing in the queer movement is a change in that. So, but what is queer just in general? And of course, I'm 50. And I always say I'm born a gay man and I am queer by choice. And that is true for some of us and not for other folks. Other folks, you just couldn't help but notice that they were different, and especially in their mannerisms. And others like me, either I learned to fit into the assignment of masculine in our culture, or else it was just a natural way for me to be, or probably a combination of both. And so when we say queer, we're talking about a few things. So first, there's the alphabet. So lesbians, gay, bisexual, transgender. So that's where we get LGBTQ for queer plus. But in that plus, we're also kind of hiding, just for convenience sake, LGBTQ questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, same-gender loving. So there are other ways that people identify. And it's really interesting. For example, some same-gender loving women like lesbian. Some same-gender loving women call themselves gay women. And some women only call themselves same-gender loving women. They don't like lesbian or gay. So there's a whole bunch of terms in that alphabet. But so we felt like we needed the word queer as an umbrella term. And that takes all different sexual minorities into it, as well as allies who choose to stand with us and not double down on sexuality or gender binary. It also takes into account all the differences on the gender spectrum. So queer is a reclaimed word. It originally meant odd, weird, right? Sometimes like gay men, we'll call ourselves fag or faggot, joking among ourselves. I don't, but some gay men do. But that's a word that doesn't really relate to anything in a nature about us. And it's a word that isn't really easily reclaimable. But queer, even though it's been used by bullies and those who would terrorize us and bash us, it's a word that has a meaning that we relate to, because really to be queer is to choose to stand in the margins as ourselves and not allow ourselves to be changed by the hetero-normative gaze of society, by the punishing gaze of society looking at us and saying, you don't love the right way, or you don't express your gender the right way. So to be queer is to say, leave us alone. We're on the margin. We don't want to be part of trying to control other people. And a lot of allies will stand out there with us. And of course, one of the things that's true, we know this from Kinsey, is that most people have some slight orientation towards same-gender attraction. And if we're going to be healthy, we may talk more about this in queer theory, but if we're going to be healthy, we realize that we have what we would term masculine and feminine energy within us. And so really, to me, the more healthy I get, the more I develop that range of gender identity, gender spectrum within myself. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm transgender, but gender queer is a term that can take that in, because queer is the umbrella. Did that make sense? That's a lot.
All right. Well, you might be thinking, if you're watching this video, that how does this relate to Lucifer? And so the next point I believe Brian wanted to bring up was the embodiment point. And certainly Lucifer is very much into the flesh and being sex positive, which most of our characters like really are, maybe all of them. One thing I've noticed is that the female characters choose their lovers at various times, and nobody ever gets gotten called a slut, or no one's ever looked at them like, what, you slept with that person? You know, it was like, no, it's just like, oh, you know, I'm glad you had a good time. Or they just don't even, you know, bother to comment on it because they apparently just feel that that's normal, which obviously Brian and I believe it should be. So, you know, the fact that no one has this judgment, you know, that people just have lovers and no one judges anyone, is probably not reflective of the real world. But in our idealized Los Angeles with Satan wandering around in the police department, it is. So, so you want to bring up a point on embodiment and sex positivity?
Yes, and I mean, I think even particularly we talk about the fact that they don't go to Jesus in this series, but I'm going to briefly touch on that. But even starting with Jesus, you know, one of the things we would both say, I think, is that Jesus was a Jew, and Jesus followed Jewish scripture, and Jesus taught Jewish teachings, and celebrated Jewish holidays, and prayed in Hebrew. And so if you go to the Hebrew scriptures, which this series does do, the Hebrew scriptures say it right there, that we're in God's image and that we are good, that the planet is good, that this world is good, to be fruitful and multiply, and whatever that means. And so embodied theory, embodied theology, queer theory, queer theology, is going to say that our bodies are good, that we should enjoy them, and that this life matters. It's important. It's not something that's to be denied, our bodies or this life, just to get to the next life, and that this planet matters. And so, you know, the green movement we're seeing now, I mean, that's a core part of our who we are. It's part of us, right? Not only do I think all people are our siblings through this theory, but all of the earth is connected to us through this. But then if you go to Jesus, which we'll just do briefly, even though this series doesn't, but so much Christian theology informs this, we would particularly say that a queer embodied Christian, that is, God took flesh. And so flesh is good. Sex is good. Sex is enjoyable. Sex is very close to spirituality. And so, and it was a big part of how same gender loving people, many of us learned that we were good, right? And we learned that what we were being told by religion, that our bodies are bad and that sex was bad, we learned that was nonsense. But because Jesus took flesh, and then Jesus lived a life on this planet, and Jesus lived on this planet. So once again, we get our bodies are good, this life is good, and this planet is important for us to preserve. And I've shared this theology here before, but we would say then it's our job to build heaven on earth. We don't know about the other heaven. There's a lot of, we've talked about, there's not much of that in the Bible. But we do know that Jesus literally gives us the words on earth as it is in heaven. So we know it's our job to build heaven on earth, and we think part of that is to enjoy our bodies, no matter what our orientation. So obviously with Lucifer, we can see a lot of versions of that. I do think it's interesting when you're talking, one of the ways that's expressed is they comment on each other's hotness a lot. And they do it in a way that's not predatory. Like it can be predatory, and there's sometimes ways that people use it as a weapon. And in our society, it's very dangerous to do that because so many people carry around sexual trauma. But the way that they do it in this story, they're not doing it to titillate, but instead they're doing it just as an acknowledgement on the beauty of human bodies, right? And on the beauty that shows out of us regardless of our body. So I think that's very queer, very embodied.
Okay. You also wanted to talk a bit about queerness on the margins of things. Certainly, Lucifer is a character who's on the margin of pretty much everything, right? So he's, as far as we know, he's the only angel who got kicked out of heaven because he seems to be the only one that's in hell. He comes to live on Earth, where then he is the only non-human that, at least for a few years, that's hanging around. So, and even among his siblings, when we have that conversation with his sister, and she's like, "You were the one I always went to when I would get bullied." It sounds like, he's the protector character. He's not like the others. So, and then Mom at some point says that he's got this really high libido, and he gets that from me, or something. And I always kind of wondered how she knew too much about that, because it's like before the fall, there apparently weren't any people, I guess, at that point, because he seems to have fallen before he met Eve. And if they're supposed to be the first people, then he was cast out of heaven before there were humans. Therefore, there are no humans in heaven to have sex with, which kind of leaves all your siblings. It makes me wonder how Mom knows how sexual he was if he only had siblings to sleep with. But okay, I think we're just sort of skip over that on the show. But but he's alone in a sense. There's like no way he has anyone to relate to. So he is kind of this unique character that isn't like his siblings. He isn't like the people that he works with. He isn't like the people that he lives around. So he isn't like the demons that he's been lording over for however many thousands of years. No, they are not like him at all. So he is really on the margins.
I mean, I guess it shouldn't be too surprising that this show, it's a more common view than dominant culture would have us be. But, I know there was a huge part of my life where I said, well, if this is going to hell, then I'd rather be in hell with us than in heaven with them, right? And so it makes sense that the Lucifer folks have kind of identified hell as the place of all this healthy way to interact with sexuality, as opposed, and even gender, I guess, as opposed to heaven, which they talk about how boring it is and nobody wants to be there once they've spent time on earth. So I do think that's interesting. This idea of the margins I mentioned, probably the biggest theorist in queer theology is named Marcella Althaus Reed. And Marcella Althaus Reed was from Buenos Aires, and she ended up being in Scotland teaching contextual theology. And she really criticized liberation theology, because that's what queer could be considered, a liberation theology for sexual minorities and gender fluid folk. And but she criticized traditional Catholic comunidades de base and all those liberation theologies, because she said they were patriarchal and they were oppressive, and that they ended up always currying favor with power and centralizing power to themselves. And she said that to be queer is to stay in the margins, as I've mentioned, but especially to look at theology from the bottom up, to look at liberation from below. And so it's always going to favor, as liberation theology says it does, a preferential option for the poor. But she uses the analogy of lemon vendors in Buenos Aires, and you smell the lemons, but she always says we should do theology with no underpants on, like the lemon vendors, because then you can smell the fragrance with our sex. And she just thinks it's important that from queer theology, we're always willing to look at gender expression, who is the least powerful, expressing their gender in a new way, and in sexual orientation, who is the least powerful in being able to love the way they want to love. So I think that all kind of comes to leave us on the margins and let us take care of us, and you go do your thing. You're welcome to join us as an ally, because we think you're probably in denial about some of your orientation or gender expression, but that's okay. But don't bring your heteronormative punishing gaze to that. Yeah.
Okay, is there anything else you want to talk about Lucifer and queer theology?
I mean, I think gender queerness, just the idea of gender is not on a binary, but on a spectrum. And I think I mentioned queerness is part of the post-colonial, post-modern movement. And like our big heroes are Derrida and Foucault. And so those are our heroes. And they particularly railed against binary thinking. That's very colonial. That's very Enlightenment era. That's very modern. And instead, we would say we're in a postmodern age where we acknowledge that it's not even a binary. So you're either male, and the further you get from male, the less value you have to modern thinking, or you're either wealthy, and the further you get from it, the less value you have, or you're of whiteness, as we've created this idea of whiteness, and the further you are from it, the less value you have. So a key part of queer theology is to blow up that that binary in every way. And again, I feel like Lucifer does that. Again, not in a way to say, oh, they're trans, and not in a way to poke fun of gender identity, but sometimes they naturally will express their other expressions of gender than their normal one. And it can sometimes be funny, but they're not doing it in a way to make fun of it. They're doing it in a way, again, without drawing attention to it, in a way that's acceptable and natural, which is what queer theorists really want. Just let us express ourselves. And as I've said, for a queer theologian, the more I experiment, explore, and become comfortable with a range of gender identity with myself, that's good. And I mean, even Lucifer, we kind of talked about the accent before, but I mean, there's even to a red-blooded American male, the way I was raised to think, a British accent is extremely fey, right? And so I do think it's funny. Lucifer to me a lot of times does not come across nearly as sexy as he is to a lot of women, but I tend to be attracted to butch guys, right? To Dan and to Marcus Kane. But again, that's always an interesting thing too, because am I attracted to that only, or are there other ways to be attracted to people that I haven't explored because of the way I was socialized? So being willing to question that, that's queer. And I think Lucifer does a lot of that. And I love that they don't draw attention to the same gender love that happens, or at least is alluded to a lot. They don't draw, and even that partnership with Lucifer and Marcus, where they're playing a gay couple, and it's very affected, but yet they're not making fun of gay men couples too much, right? They're doing it with love, and they're doing it in a way that we don't feel attacked. And so I think that's all part of just not being binary about it, being open to where it flows.
All right. Well, if you have any comments on what we had to say today, I hope you put them in the comments. If you like this episode, hit the like and subscribe, but you can hit the dislike too, just like somebody did for the favorite scenes episode, and we will welcome that as well. And you can hit the bell notification to know when I put up more videos. So we'll see you next time on Infernal Intercourse.
Bye-bye.